I always thought myself a decent judge of character. Maybe that's why, when I saw a guy thumbing a ride on the highway just outside a small town in Nevada, I didn't think twice before pulling over. He looked harmless enough, a little rough around the edges, sure, but I figured he was just down on his luck. Besides, it was nearing dusk, and the highway was barren. Something about leaving someone stranded in that kind of desert darkness didn't sit right with me. I rolled down the window. "Where you headed?" "East," he said simply. "Got family up in Utah." His eyes were shadowed by the brim of a baseball cap, but I caught a glimpse of his face as he approached. Late 30s, maybe early 40s, a bit sunburnt but not unfriendly. His clothes were dusty but clean. I figured he'd just been on the road for a while. I unlocked the door. "Hop in." We made small talk at first. His name was Joe, and he'd been hitching across the country for months. His story wasn't much different from others I'd heard. Lost his job, his house, everything really. He was just trying to make it to his family and start over. I sympathized. Life could be brutal sometimes. The desert stretched on for miles in every direction. A burnt orange sky began to melt into purple as the sun dipped lower. We passed the occasional truck, but for the most part, we were alone on that empty highway. After a while, the conversation tapered off. Joe stared out the window, quiet. The silence didn't bother me at first, but as night fully descended, the air in the car started to feel heavier. I chalked it up to the long drive and the empty vastness around us. Then Joe shifted in a seat. "You ever pick up hitchhikers before?" The question caught me off guard. "A few times," I said, glancing over. His face was unreadable in the dim light, just the shadow of his cap and a faint outline of his jaw. "Ever think about the kinds of people you're letting into your car?" I laughed it off, trying to lighten the mood. "I trust my gut." Joe didn't smile. He just stared ahead, his hands resting calmly on his lap. "Your gut ever been wrong?" The uneasy silence that followed his question was thick as molasses. My stomach knotted, though I wasn't sure why. I kept my eyes on the road, but I could feel Joe watching me now, his presence suddenly heavier. "Mind if I smoke?" he asked. "Sure," I said, maybe too quickly. Anything to break the tension. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it, the brief flash of the lighter illuminating his face. For the first time, I noticed a scar running from the corner of his mouth up to his ear. It wasn't fresh, but it was deep, jagged. The kind you don't forget. He took a drag, then exhaled slowly. "You ever hear about that guy? The one who picks up drivers instead of the other way around?" I frowned, glancing over again. "What do you mean?" Joe turned to face me, his eyes catching the glow from the dashboard lights now. "There's a guy out there. People say he pretends to hitchhike. Once he gets a ride, he takes whatever he wants. Money, car, sometimes more." His voice was low, almost casual, but there was something underneath it. A tension that wasn't there before. I swallowed hard. "Sounds like an urban legend." "Maybe," Joe said. "Or maybe he's just good at what he does." I forced a laugh, though my hands gripped the wheel tighter now. The dark road stretched on endlessly ahead of us, no lights in sight. Just the void. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just let a snake into my car. Joe flicked the cigarette but out the window, then sat back, stretching his legs. "Think about it. Who's more vulnerable? The guy on the side of the road, or the one who stops for him?" Without warning, Joe reached into his jacket. My heart leapt into my throat, adrenaline surging as I instinctively jerked the wheel. The car swerved slightly, tires skidding on the gravel shoulder before I corrected it. "What the hell, man?" I snapped, my voice shaky. Joe slowly pulled out a folded map. He held it up casually, giving me a sideways glance. "Relax," he said, opening it. "I was just going to ask you to take this exit coming up. There's a gas station not far from here. I could use a drink." My pulse was still racing, but I nodded, not trusting my voice. Sure enough, there was an exit coming up, and I took it, the car rattling slightly as we pulled onto a deserted side road. The gas station appeared after a few minutes. Old, run down, barely lit. Joe pointed to it. "This'll do." I pulled up near the pump, and Joe turned to me. "You mind waiting a few minutes? I won't be long." "Sure," I muttered, still on edge. He stepped out of the car, stretching his arms before walking toward the small convenience store. I watched him go, heart still thudding in my chest. Something about him didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't pin down exactly why. And then I saw it, his jacket pocket flapping slightly as he walked. A flash of silver. Not a map. A knife. Panic surged through me. I glanced around. There were no other cars, no one to call for help. My eyes darted to the gas station. Joe was inside, his back turned to the window. This was my chance. Without thinking, I threw the car into gear and floored it, tires screeching as I sped out of the parking lot and back onto the road. My heart pounded in my ears, hands trembling on the wheel. The image of that knife flashed in my mind over and over again. Had I really just driven away from danger? Or was I running from my own paranoia? I drove for miles, barely breathing until the neon lights of a bigger town finally came into view. I pulled into a well-lit diner parking lot, hands still shaking. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd overreacted. But as I reached into my back seat for my bag, something stopped me cold. It wasn't my bag. It was his. Joe's old, dusty backpack, sitting there like a ghost, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't escaped it all. It was February, and the mountains of Colorado were cloaked in deep snow, the sky overcast with the promise of more to come. I was coming back from a ski trip that had ended sooner than planned after a falling out with my friends. With no ride back to Denver, I was stuck trying to hitchhike my way home. I figured I could catch a ride from someone heading down the mountain, but the frigid air and biting wind made the wait unbearable. I had my thumb out for over an hour, the cold seeping into my bones, when finally a rusty old pickup truck pulled over. The driver was a grizzled man in his 50s, wearing a heavy plaid jacket and a battered cowboy hat. He leaned across the seat and opened the passenger door. "Need a lift?" His voice was raspy but friendly enough, and desperate to escape the cold, I climbed in. The heat inside the truck was a welcome relief, and I rubbed my hands together, trying to regain feeling in my fingers. The driver introduced himself as Joe, a local who had lived in the mountains his whole life. He didn't say much at first, just kept his eyes on the winding road, but I wasn't in the mood for conversation either. I just wanted to get off the mountain and back to the city. As we climbed higher into the mountains instead of descending, I started to get a bit uneasy. The road was becoming narrower, the snow deeper, and the visibility worse as fog rolled in. "Is this the way to Denver?" I asked, glancing over at him. He grunted in response. "Shortcut," he said, not taking his eyes off the road. "We'll be there quicker this way." I tried to relax, but something about the situation felt off. The further we went, the less I could see through the windshield, snow now falling thickly, and the road growing more treacherous by the minute. My unease grew when I realized we hadn't passed another car in miles. The storm intensified, snow piling up on the road as the truck's tires crunched through it. I could barely see 10 feet in front of the truck when Joe suddenly veered off the road and onto an unmarked snow-covered path. My heart rate spiked. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my pulse was racing. "Trust me," Joe muttered, his eyes narrowing. "I know a place where we can wait out the storm." I didn't trust him. I'd heard stories of people disappearing in these mountains, of strange accidents and mysterious disappearances. My gut told me to get out, but the blizzard outside was brutal, and stepping into it without a plan seemed like a death sentence. The truck jerked to a halt in front of a dilapidated cabin, barely visible through the swirling snow. Joe turned off the engine and sat there for a moment in silence before turning to me. "Storm's getting worse. We'll be safer in there," he said, nodding toward the cabin. But I wasn't convinced. I could feel the tension in the air, like the walls were closing in. Without a word, I grabbed my backpack and bolted from the truck, the icy wind biting at my face as I stumbled through the snow. Behind me, I could hear Joe's voice shouting, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't see where I was going, but the panic was stronger than the cold. I tripped over a snow-covered root and fell hard, my hands plunging into the snow. Behind me, I heard the crunch of footsteps. Joe was coming after me. The trees closed in around me, the storm drowning out most of the sounds except for my own gasping breaths. I stumbled forward, my heart racing, the snow getting deeper with every step. Joe's footsteps were close now, too close. I didn't dare look back, knowing that if I stopped, I might not have the strength to keep going. The blizzard swallowed everything around me, and all I could think about was finding some kind of shelter before I froze or worse. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I spotted headlights through the trees, a snowplow making its slow way up the road. Summoning the last of my energy, I ran toward the light, waving my arms frantically. I burst through the trees and onto the road just as the snowplow came to a grinding halt. The driver leaned out of the cab, confused but alarmed at the sight of me collapsing onto the road. He helped me into the plow, and I couldn't stop shaking from both the cold and the fear. Behind us, Joe emerged from the woods, his face twisted in anger, but he didn't approach. The plow driver turned the machine around and started down the mountain, leaving Joe standing in the snow, watching us disappear into the storm. I never learned what Joe had planned for me in that cabin, but I didn't want to find out. I was just grateful to be alive, knowing that I had barely escaped what could have been a deadly trap. It was 1993, early fall, and the air had a crisp bite to it, just enough to remind me that winter wasn't far off. I was 26, broke, and trying to get back to Denver after a failed trip to visit a friend in Oregon. Bus tickets were out of the question, and I wasn't keen on sleeping in any more cheap motels, so I did what I'd always done when money was tight. I stuck my thumb out and hoped for a ride. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through barren, rolling hills. I had been standing by the road for what felt like hours, the cold wind whipping at my jacket, when an old blue sedan finally slowed and pulled over ahead of me. The car had seen better days. Rust spots ate at the fenders, and one of the tail lights was cracked, but at that moment, it looked like salvation. The driver leaned over, pushed open the passenger door, and gave me a nod. He was an older man, maybe late 50s, with graying hair and thick glasses. His face was unreadable, a mask of mild disinterest. I hesitated for just a moment. Something about him seemed off, but I was tired and desperate, so I ignored the warning bell ringing faintly in the back of my mind and climbed in. "Where you headed?" he asked, his voice gravelly but calm. "Denver," I replied, settling into the worn seat. He nodded again and pulled back onto the highway without another word. The first half hour passed in relative silence, just the hum of the engine and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. The man introduced himself as Ray, and though he was short on words, his driving was steady and deliberate. I let myself relax a little, thinking I might have lucked out with a quiet but reliable ride. As the miles blurred together, we passed fewer and fewer cars. The landscape outside grew more desolate, just endless flat plains and the occasional patch of scrubland. I glanced at Ray from time to time, trying to get a read on him, but his face remained impassive, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Every time I attempted small talk, he'd give me one or two-word answers before lapsing back into silence. It was around the time the sun began to dip below the horizon that things started to feel wrong. The atmosphere in the car had shifted subtly, the air thickening with a tension I couldn't quite place. Ray's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white, and his eyes seemed to narrow in concentration. We hadn't passed any exits for a while, and there were no towns or gas stations in sight, just a growing sense of isolation. I cleared my throat, trying to ease the tension. "You know how much longer until we hit a town?" I asked. Ray didn't answer immediately. His jaw worked, clenching and unclenching, before he finally muttered, "Not much further." But I wasn't sure I believed him. Suddenly, without warning, Ray swerved the car off the highway onto a dirt road. My stomach lurched as I gripped the door handle, bracing myself against the sharp turn. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. Ray didn't look at me. "Just taking a shortcut," he said flatly. I didn't buy it. The narrow, uneven road led us deeper into what looked like nothing, just more flat, empty land. My pulse quickened, and that faint warning bell in my mind became a full-on alarm. "Let me out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady but firm. Ray ignored me, his focus still locked on the road ahead. My chest tightened. I tried again, louder this time. I said, "Let me out." This time, he glanced over at me, his expression dark, unreadable. "You don't want to be out here," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Ain't nothing out there for you." Panic flared in my chest. I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, Ray's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "I said you don't want to be out there," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. My heart raced, pounding in my ears. I yanked my hand free, adrenaline surging through my veins as I realized I was trapped. The dirt road seemed to stretch forever, winding further into the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, the car screeched to a halt. We were in the middle of a wide, empty field, far from any sign of civilization. Ray turned off the engine, the sudden silence pressing down on me like a weight. He turned to face me fully for the first time, his eyes gleaming with something cold, something predatory. "Get out," he said softly, almost a whisper. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around. There was nothing but flat, barren land in every direction. No houses, no lights, no cars. Just Ray and me. I knew I had no choice. My fingers trembled as I fumbled with the door handle, pushing it open with a shaky breath. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I took off, sprinting into the field, my shoes slipping in the loose dirt. Behind me, I heard Ray's door slam shut, and I could hear his slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the ground. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," his voice called out from behind me, chilling in its calmness. I didn't look back. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed in protest, but I pushed myself harder, running as fast as I could. The field stretched on forever, no cover in sight, but I couldn't stop. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, and I could feel his presence, his shadow, looming over me. I was running on pure instinct, my body acting on the primal fear that if I stopped, if I faltered for even a second, I wouldn't survive. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a faint glow on the horizon. Headlights, a road. Without thinking, I veered toward the light, my hope rising even as exhaustion clawed at me. I could hear Ray's footsteps faltering behind me, and that gave me the extra push I needed. I sprinted toward the highway, my body on the verge of collapse, and just as the truck's headlights illuminated me, I threw myself into the road, waving my arms frantically. The truck screeched to a halt, and I pounded on the door, breathless, desperate. The driver, a wide-eyed woman, looked at me in shock. "Please," I gasped, "let me in." I didn't look back as I climbed into the truck, my entire body trembling. The woman drove off without asking questions, but she kept glancing at me with concern in her eyes. I couldn't bring myself to explain what had just happened. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of Ray in the rearview mirror, standing motionless by his car, watching us fade into the distance. His figure grew smaller and smaller until it was swallowed by the night. I never hitchhiked again after that. Even now, all these years later, I can still hear the crunch of Ray's footsteps behind me, slow and steady, like death creeping closer.